Rain splattered against the dark streets of the industrial district like tiny crystal daggers, each drop bouncing off puddles that reflected neon signs flickering with tired light. Mark Reynolds, 42, trudged along the sidewalk, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against the chill. Another long night, another shift, guarding a factory that seemed to care little whether the lights stayed on or not. He pushed open the door to the late-night cafe, greeted by the familiar smell of burnt coffee and the faint warmth of oven-baked bread. The bell above the door jingled, a small, lonely sound against the hum of the night. Mark nodded at the barista, a young woman yawning behind the counter, and slid into his usual seat by the window. Outside, the rain blurred the city into smears of color. Inside, the dim amber light reflected off chrome tables and cracked leather chairs. He always chose this spot. Corner, window, a clear view of everything, but nobody looking directly at him. He didn't eat because he was hungry. He ate because the routine grounded him, the only thing that kept him from sinking entirely into the hollow ache that had settled over his life since the divorce. A lukewarm cup of coffee, a half-cooked sandwich, a brief scroll through his phone, just to remind himself the world was still spinning, even if he no longer felt part of it. Tonight felt like all the other nights, gray, empty, predictable. Until the door opened again, letting in a gust of wind that carried with it the scent of wet coats and worn shoes. Mark looked up, and for the first time in months, the world seemed to pause. Standing there, dripping and shivering, was a woman no older than 30, clutching the hand of a small boy. His backpack hung from one shoulder, soaked through, and his eyes were wide, weary, holding a sadness that cut straight to Mark's chest. Mark's first instinct was to look away. He didn't want to get involved. He didn't want the weight of someone else's problems pressing into the fragile walls he'd built around himself. But something in the boy's eyes, something painfully human, made him freeze. His hand tightened around the cup of coffee, warmth seeping into his fingers. And without fully realizing it, Mark made a choice that would change all of their lives. The rain continued its relentless rhythm outside, drumming against the cafe windows like a relentless heartbeat. The hum of the neon sign outside flickered intermittently, casting brief shadows across the empty tables. Mark sat in his usual corner, fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic cup of coffee, eyes tracing the distorted reflections of the streetlights and the puddles beyond the glass. It was quiet, peaceful in its way, a sanctuary from the rest of the world. And then, the bell above the door rang again. Mark barely looked up at first. The sound was normal, ordinary. But when the gust of cold air swept in, carrying with it a sharp scent of wet coats and damp hair, his attention snapped. Two figures stepped inside. A woman, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face, and a small boy clinging to her side like a lifeline. His little frame trembled, tiny fingers gripping the strap of a battered backpack, his wide eyes scanning the cafe as if searching for a refuge he had been denied 1,000 times before. Mark's chest tightened. There was something raw in their presence, something unfiltered, something that didn't belong to the curated misery of the city night. He felt an unfamiliar tug, an unease he hadn't felt in months. He looked away, returning to his coffee, pretending the world had not intruded into his quiet corner. The woman approached the counter cautiously, her steps hesitant, boots squelching with each stride. She caught the barista's eye, who was now fully awake, rubbing her temples. The cafe was nearly empty, save for Mark and a man dozing in the far corner, newspaper folded over his face. "Excuse me," the woman began softly, her voice cracking, weighted with exhaustion. Can we have something for my son? Just something to eat." The barista's brow furrowed. She shook her head, her voice polite but firm. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We don't give food on credit." The woman's shoulders slumped. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of shame and desperation, flicked toward her son. The boy buried his face into her shoulder, shivering. The mother whispered, almost to herself, "It's okay, baby." Mark felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't meant to listen, but the cafe was quiet enough that her trembling voice carried through the air. And in that moment, the world seemed to stop. He recognized something in them, a helplessness, a silent plea for kindness, that mirrored a part of himself he had long tried to forget. He observed them from his corner, trying to rationalize why this small scene was affecting him so profoundly. He had spent months isolating himself, convinced that emotions were dangerous, that attachments only led to pain. And yet, here was a boy, eyes wide and hungry, and a mother, fragile but dignified, standing before him. Something stirred deep inside, a memory, a long-forgotten instinct to protect, to care. The boy glanced up at the barista, and then at Mark, a flicker of hope passing across his tired face. Mark caught it, and something inside him shifted. He realized he could not sit idly by. He could not allow their need to go unanswered when he had the means to help, even if he did not know why he felt compelled to do so. Mark set his coffee cup down slowly, its warmth seeping into his fingers. He rose, chair scraping softly against the tile floor. The sound turned heads, but he didn't care. He approached the counter, his voice calm, quiet, but carrying an authority born of certainty. "Add whatever they want to my bill," he said, simply. The barista blinked in surprise. The woman's eyes widened, disbelief and relief mingling on her face. "No, you don't have to. I can—" "It's fine," Mark interrupted gently. "Sit down." The mother hesitated, glancing at the boy, then back at Mark. Would it be okay if we sit with you?" Mark blinked. He had spent months avoiding company, avoiding connection, and yet he found himself nodding. Sure. They approached his table cautiously, as though stepping into a new, uncharted world. The boy, Leo, climbed into the chair across from him, eyes wide with cautious curiosity. His mother, Sophia, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and they both settled into the small booth beside him. The waitress brought over 2 bowls of soup and slices of warm bread. Mark watched as Leo's small hands clumsily held the spoon, taking tentative bites. The boy's eyes lit up with the first real joy Mark had seen in months, a reminder of innocence that had not yet been eroded by the harshness of life. Sophia smiled softly, a fleeting warmth that broke through Mark's long-held barriers. Mark found himself listening to their quiet conversation, learning about their struggles without them asking for sympathy. Sophia spoke of lost jobs, eviction notices, nights spent in overcrowded shelters. Yet through it all, she maintained a dignity, a courage that resonated deeply with Mark. And Leo, for all his exhaustion, found moments of laughter, pointing out shapes in the rain-smeared window, asking questions about the neon lights that reflect like stars in the puddles. It was a small miracle in the mundane, a flicker of warmth in the endless gray of Mark's nights. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt an unfamiliar stirring of hope that connection, even fleeting, could be a balm to a wounded heart. As they ate, Mark wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to retreat, to return to his solitude, to let the world's pain remain distant. But another part, the part that had once loved, once cared, once felt, urged him to stay, to engage, to offer what he could, even if it was just this small act of kindness. He thought of his estranged daughter, of nights spent alone in his apartment, of regrets he could not undo. And he realized that this moment, small though it seemed, was a chance to reclaim a fragment of himself. Perhaps it wasn't just about feeding a hungry boy. Perhaps it was about feeding something inside him that had been starving far longer. The rain outside softened into a drizzle, mist curling along the edges of the cafe windows. The neon lights flickered less aggressively, as if the night itself was breathing easier. Mark, Sophia, and Leo sat together, a fragile triangle of warmth and hope. For now, the world outside could wait. For now, there was connection, and it was enough. And as the boys' laughter echoed softly through the small cafe, Mark understood that sometimes the universe delivered reminders of humanity when you least expected them. Reminders that even in the loneliest nights, kindness could be found, and with it, the first steps toward healing. The warm steam from the bowls of soup curled into the dim cafe light, a soft golden haze that seemed to push back the shadows of the night. Mark watched Leo bring the spoon to his mouth for the second time, his little hands trembling slightly, but steady enough to taste the warmth, the comfort he hadn't felt in days. And as he chewed, his eyes met Mark's across the table, And for a fleeting second, there was trust, curiosity, and something that Mark hadn't realized he'd missed: connection. The cafe, usually silent except for the occasional hum of the fridge and the drip of the coffee machine, felt alive. Each clink of a spoon against a bowl, each soft laugh Leo emitted, was amplified in Mark's ears, each one like a small drumbeat reviving a part of him he thought he had lost forever. Mark leaned back slightly, the weight of the world pressing down on him in an unfamiliar way. His hands were wrapped around the warm mug, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of his own nights of solitude, the hollow apartment that smelled faintly of stale coffee and old regrets, the sound of silence that had become almost unbearable. And now, here they were, a mother and her child, strangers, standing in the same storm he had been trying to outrun in his own life. Something shifted in him. Without conscious thought, Mark reached into his coat pocket, feeling the smooth leather of his wallet. The act itself was mechanical at first, a reflex, but the moment he pulled it out, the weight of the decision settled over him. It wasn't just about paying for their meal. It was a small rebellion against his isolation, a bridge to humanity he hadn't realized he needed. "Add whatever they want to my bill," he said, voice quiet but firm. Sophia's eyes widened, disbelief mingling with relief. She shook her head, words catching in her throat. "No, I can pay, please." "You don't owe me anything," Mark said, softly. The waitress blinked, caught between professionalism and the quiet miracle unfolding before her eyes. Mark nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement that sometimes rules could wait in the face of real human need. Sophia hesitated for a moment, glancing at her son. Would it be okay if we sit with you?" Mark blinked, the old instinct to recoil fighting with something deeper. Months of carefully constructed walls, of avoiding human interaction, pressed against him. And yet, seeing the fear and trust in Leo's eyes, he felt his defenses crumble. "Sure," he said quietly. They slid into the booth across from him. Leo sat stiffly at first, unsure of the rules of this new interaction. Mark offered a small smile, the first genuine expression he had made in a long time. "I'm Mark," he said, extending a hand. Leo stared, then tentatively shook it, his small fingers barely covering Mark's. Sophia smiled softly, grateful, her eyes glistening with a quiet, restrained emotion. The trio sat together, a triangle of warmth amid the cold, damp night. And for the first time that evening, Mark allowed himself to truly notice them. The worn edges of Sophia's coat, the way Leo's hair curled damply at his forehead, the slight tremor in Sophia's voice as she whispered encouragement to her son. These were details that normally would have gone unnoticed, drowned out by the hum of loneliness. But now they anchored him, made him feel, reminded him he was alive. As they ate, the conversation began, cautious at first, almost imperceptible. Leo pointed out shapes in the rain-streaked window, creating stories about dragons and knights that only he could see. His mother laughed softly, correcting his imaginary tales with gentle humor. And Mark found himself listening, really listening, in a way he hadn't done in years. Each story, each laugh, each shy smile chipped away at the walls around his heart. Sophia spoke carefully about their situation, careful not to sound pitiful, describing the nights spent in shelters, the evictions, the job losses, but always emphasizing the love she had for her son. And Mark felt the weight of recognition. He had been through loss too, the hollow ache of dreams crumbling, of solitude stretching endlessly. Yet here, in the warmth of the cafe and the quiet trust of strangers, he felt a strange kinship. "I used to come home to an empty apartment," Mark admitted quietly. It's a hard thing to get used to." Sophia's eyes softened. "I know what that feels like," she said. Mark nodded. He understood. For months, he had hidden his grief, pretending it didn't exist. And now, hearing it mirrored in someone else's voice, he felt something shift, something that could only be called hope. Leo, oblivious to the gravity of their conversation, clumsily reached for another spoonful of soup. His small hands trembled, but determination sparkled in his eyes. He looked up at Mark, and Mark smiled. Not a polite, automatic smile, a real one, warm, open. And in that moment, Mark realized that Leo's trust, so fragile and delicate, had given him a gift he hadn't expected: the ability to feel joy again. Mark asked gently. "Leo!" exclaimed, a bright, unfiltered happiness breaking through months of hunger and fear. He dipped the spoon carefully, watching the liquid ripple, and then took another bite. Mark's heart ached and warmed at the same time. Sophia reached across the table, squeezing Leo's hand. "He's all right now," she murmured. Mark shook his head. "No, thanks to both of you." As the night deepened, the cafe seemed to cocoon them, insulating them from the cold and the relentless rain outside. Mark watched Leo laugh at a small joke Sophia made, the sound pure and untainted. He noticed how Sophia's eyes softened when she looked at her son, the resilience and love radiating from her like warmth from a hearth. And he realized something profound. Kindness, even in the smallest gestures, had the power to heal wounds he hadn't known were still open. Mark's decision to step forward had not been monumental, no heroic battle, no dramatic confrontation. Just a simple act of paying for a meal, offering a seat, sharing space. Yet it had begun a chain reaction that would alter their lives. It was a reminder that even the smallest decisions could ripple outward, touching hearts, changing trajectories, mending broken spirits. He looked at Sophia, at Leo, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of purpose that wasn't about routine or obligation or self-preservation. It was about connection, about humanity, about hope. By the time they finished their meal, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The neon reflections in the puddles outside softened into gentle pools of light. Sophia whispered her thanks again, voice trembling. Mark nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that words weren't needed anymore. The act itself, simple as it was, had created something extraordinary, a bridge between strangers, a spark of warmth in a cold night. Leo's eyes were heavy with sleep, but a small, contented smile lingered. He curled up slightly in his mother's lap, and Mark watched, silently amazed at the resilience of this little boy. And as he sipped the last of his lukewarm coffee, Mark realized that this night, this small, quiet act of kindness, had begun to heal parts of him that he had believed lost forever. The drizzle outside had softened to a gentle mist, making the city streets glisten under the neon glow. Inside the cafe, the golden light reflected softly off the chrome surfaces, creating a cocoon of warmth against the chill of the night. Mark watched Leo carefully spoon another bite of soup into his mouth, his small fingers shaking slightly with concentration. Sophia's gaze never left her son, a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and quiet hope etched across her face. Mark felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in months. It wasn't just empathy, it was a recognition of shared humanity, of survival, of the fragile bonds that could grow in unexpected places. And in that moment, he realized that this night was no longer about feeding a boy and his mother. It was about rediscovering what it meant to care, to connect, to be alive. After the meal, the three of them lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of the cafe. Mark shifted in his chair, trying to find the right words. "You?" asked softly, careful not to sound intrusive. Sophia sighed, a weary, gentle sound. "It's been a rough month. I lost my job at the bakery, and we were evicted a few days ago. We've been moving between shelters, but they're all full." Mark nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He recognized the same exhaustion in her eyes that he had seen in himself many times. Nights when life felt like an endless grind, and no one was watching, no one cared. Yet Sophia carried herself with dignity, a quiet strength that inspired him more than he could say. Leo, sensing the tension but eager to lighten the mood, piped up. "I like your coat, mister." Mark chuckled softly, the first real laugh he had felt in weeks escaping. "Thanks, buddy. It's old, but it keeps me dry." The boy grinned, and for a moment, the weight of the world outside melted into the warmth of shared smiles. Over the next few minutes, Mark began to offer small gestures of kindness, passing napkins, refilling the boy's cup with warm cocoa, even teasing Leo gently about spilling a little soup. Each small act built trust, a bridge between strangers that grew with each smile, each glance, each quiet word. "You're very kind," Sophia murmured softly, almost to herself. Mark shook his head. "I'm just doing what feels right." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "It's not easy." Mark felt a lump in his throat. He had thought himself immune to warmth, to connection, yet here he was, feeling something profound, something that had been absent for far too long. As the night wore on, they began to talk more openly. Sophia shared small memories of Leo's early years, his first steps, his first words, the nights she stayed up nursing him through fevers. Mark listened intently, occasionally nodding, sometimes interjecting with gentle questions. The boy's laughter occasionally punctuated the conversation, a reminder of innocence that persisted even in hardship. Mark spoke carefully about himself, about his divorce, his estrangement from his teenage daughter, and the nights spent alone in his apartment, staring at empty walls. I I lost track of myself for a while," he admitted quietly. "I stopped caring about anything. People, life, myself." Sophia smiled softly. "You've already shown that." Leo, oblivious to the deeper conversation, leaned over the table to show Mark a drawing he had scribbled on a napkin. "This is us now," he said proudly. Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest, a fragile, tender flame that had been buried under years of grief and solitude. He nodded, genuinely. The next few hours passed like minutes. Mark, Sophia, and Leo shared stories, jokes, and even quiet silences that felt comfortable rather than empty. The cafe seemed to shrink around them, the hum of the city fading into the background. Each moment, no matter how small, was a thread weaving them together into a fragile tapestry of trust. Mark watched as Sophia showed Leo how to fold a napkin into a tiny paper boat, laughing softly as it floated across the table. He laughed too, the sound feeling strange and foreign in his own ears, yet liberating. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to forget the emptiness that had defined his nights, even if only for a while. By the time the waitress brought the check for Mark's earlier generosity, he realized something important. This wasn't about paying a bill. This was about opening a door he hadn't realized he'd closed for so long. It was about taking the first step toward reconnecting with the world, with kindness, with life. Even as he offered another round of hot drinks, Mark's mind wrestled with hesitation. He had spent months avoiding attachments, convinced that caring would only bring more pain. And yet, here was a woman and a child, not asking for pity, but for a moment of human connection, and he couldn't walk away. Mark asked tentatively, careful not to overstep. "It's small, but it's warm. You can rest, maybe stay dry, until you find a place." Sophia's eyes widened in surprise. She opened her mouth to protest, but found herself unable to. There was something in Mark's voice, in the quiet sincerity of his offer, that made her believe him. We couldn't possibly. It's fine here," she began, but Leo tugged gently at her sleeve, his eyes wide and hopeful. Mark smiled gently at the boy. "It's okay, really." Sophia's eyes glistened. And in that moment, a fragile trust was forged, a bond that would extend beyond the walls of the cafe and into the lives of all three of them. The night outside was quiet now, the rain tapering into gentle mist. Mark, Sophia, and Leo walked out together, the boy's small hand wrapped in his mother's, the warmth of the cafe still lingering in their hearts. For the first time, Mark felt the possibility of hope, of connection, of a life that could include laughter, care, and unexpected joy. As they parted for the evening, promising to meet again the next day, Mark felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't known in years. This wasn't just a moment of kindness, it was the beginning of something transformative, a journey toward healing, belonging, and rediscovered humanity. And as they watched them disappear into the night, Mark realized that sometimes the lives meant to heal us arrive when we least expect them, carrying warmth, hope, and the gentle reminder that no one is truly alone. The morning sun filtered softly through the blinds of Mark's small apartment, casting warm stripes across the wooden floor. Outside, the city stirred awake, unaware that a quiet miracle had begun in a modest, unassuming home. Inside, laughter echoed softly, a sound Mark hadn't heard in months, maybe years. It was tentative at first, coming from Leo as he scrawled crayon drawings across a table, but it was real. It was alive. And it was a sound Mark realized he had been missing more than he knew. Beside him, Sophia moved carefully around the kitchen, preparing breakfast with a focus that was both tender and practical. The aroma of eggs and toast filled the small space, intertwining with the faint smell of coffee that Mark had brewed for himself. For the first time in months, the apartment didn't feel empty. It felt lived in, vibrant, and full of potential. Leo hummed a little tune as he drew, occasionally glancing up to show Mark the latest stick figure creation. "Look, this is you, Mommy, and me," he said proudly, the figures holding hands under a smiling sun. Mark smiled softly, leaning back in his chair. "It's perfect, buddy." Sophia placed a plate in front of Leo and another beside her own pup. "I never thought we'd have a quiet morning like this," she murmured, eyes flicking to Mark with a mixture of gratitude and tentative trust. Mark nodded. "Neither did I," he admitted. And in that small kitchen, with sunlight catching dust motes in the air, the three of them settled into a rhythm. It wasn't grand, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Connection, laughter, and care filled the space once dominated by solitude and uncertainty. Over the next few days, the apartment became a sanctuary. Mark watched as Sophia tucked Leo into bed at night, singing softly, her voice carrying the weight of both exhaustion and love. He observed their routines, the small gestures of tenderness, and slowly, quietly, felt his own heart shift. He found himself offering guidance, sharing stories of his own life, cautioning, encouraging, laughing, and listening. He was not a replacement for what Sophia had lost, nor she for what he had lost, but together they began to create a new kind of family, one built not on history, but on shared moments, mutual care, and trust. Leo thrived. His laughter became more frequent, his curiosity boundless. He brought small treasures home, found sticks, rocks with interesting shapes, little drawings, and proudly showed them to both adults. Each item, no matter how trivial, became a symbol of hope, a small piece of light in a previously dark world. Sophia, too, grew stronger. With Mark's support, she began applying for work again, reaching out to local networks. And while life was still challenging, she carried herself with a quiet resilience, bolstered by the knowledge that her son, and now Mark, were behind her, rooting for her success and well-being. Mark, who had once believed himself incapable of connection, began to realize that life could still hold meaning, even after loss. He reconnected with his estranged daughter, reaching out slowly, honestly, sharing his experiences, and listening to hers. It was not immediate, nor was it easy, but each conversation chipped away at the walls he had built around himself. And while he hadn't planned to become a caretaker, a mentor, a friend, he found fulfillment in these roles. He discovered that his life, though altered by grief and loneliness, could still intersect meaningfully with others. And sometimes, the smallest acts, paying for a meal, offering a seat, listening, could ignite change far greater than he had ever imagined. Weeks later, Mark took Sophia and Leo back to the cafe where it all began. The familiar smell of coffee and bread greeted them, and the barista, now smiling knowingly, waved at them. Yes?" she asked. "Yes," Mark replied. "We wanted to show our thanks." They ordered breakfast, and as they sat down, Mark noticed the cafe through different eyes. What had once been a place of quiet solitude now felt alive with potential, filled with memories, connection, and the hum of ordinary kindness. He watched Leo laugh at a small mishap, saw Sophia smile warmly, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. "You've given us more than a meal," Sophia said quietly, Mark smiled softly. No. The next months were a montage of small victories and quiet joys. Leo thriving in school, Sophia finding work at a community clinic, Mark volunteering part-time to mentor youth, reconnecting with friends, and sharing meals together as a makeshift family. Their bond, forged in a moment of vulnerability and human kindness, had grown into something lasting, something real. One evening, they sat together in Mark's living room, Leo drawing at the table, Sophia reading quietly beside him, and Mark sipping coffee, content. He looked around at the two people who had unknowingly saved him, as much as he had helped them, and felt a deep, enduring sense of gratitude. Sometimes, Mark thought, life sends the people we need when we least expect it. The rain returned that night, soft and steady, pattering against the windows of Mark's apartment. But inside, it felt warm, alive, and safe. Leo's laughter carried over the soft hum of the heater, Sophia hummed a gentle tune, and Mark sat back, reflecting on the journey that had begun with a small act, a meal shared, a hand extended, a connection formed. The world outside continued in its relentless rhythm, indifferent to individual struggles. But inside this small apartment, the universe had made room for healing, for laughter, and for love. And for Mark, Sophia, and Leo, the journey of rebuilding their lives together had just begun. Sometimes, the strangers who enter our lives are not just coincidences. They are the people who remind us that kindness, compassion, and connection can heal even the deepest wounds.